The autopsy revealed a contradiction. The subject possessed the body of an elite athlete, but the right leg ended abruptly in a stump. For 7 years, Kerry Von Erich was a medical anomaly, winning championships on a prosthetic device hidden by duct tape. He was a mutant, operating in plain sight, sustained only by opioids and adrenaline. In the end, he executed himself at age 33 to protect a single forensic truth. The golden boy was an amputee. Kerry Jean Adkisson entered the world on February 3, 1960, in Niagara Falls, New York, though his soul and his fate would be tied to the red dirt of Texas. He was the fourth son of Jack Adkisson, known to the world as the feared wrestling villain Fritz Von Erich. From the moment he could walk, it was clear Kerry was different. In the hierarchy of the Von Erich ranch, survival depended on toughness. His older brothers, Kevin and David, were rugged, scrapping for their father's approval in a household run like a boot camp. But Kerry was an anomaly. He possessed a physical gift that defied logic. While his brothers had to work for their muscle, Kerry seemed to simply expand. He had the physiology of a comic book superhero, a tapered waist, massive deltoids, and an explosive, fast-twitch muscle capability that put him in the top percentile of human athletics. However, this physical perfection hid a sensitive, almost fragile temperament. Teachers and childhood friends recall Kerry not as a fighter, but as a space cadet, a sweet, wandering mind that struggled with focus, but excelled at dreaming. He didn't have the killer instinct of Kevin or the sharp, manipulative intelligence of David. Kerry was soft-hearted. He brought stray animals home. He avoided confrontation. In the brutal, hyper-masculine world of Fritz von Erich, this softness was a liability. It made him a target for his father's aggressive molding. Fritz saw the million-dollar body and decided early on that Kerry's personality would simply have to be broken and reset to fit the family business. By his teenage years, Kerry found a sanctuary away from the violent noise of his father's wrestling promotion, the discus throw. Track and field is the antithesis of professional wrestling. Wrestling is scripted, collaborative, and subjective. The outcome is decided by a booker in a back room. The discus is objective. It is cold, hard reality. You step into the concrete circle, you spin, you release, and the tape measure tells the truth. There is no politics in gravity. For Kerry, the discus circle became his church. It was the one place where he wasn't Fritz von Erich's boy. He was just Kerry Adkisson, the record breaker. At Norman High School and later at the University of Houston, he became a phenomenon. He broke the world junior record. His technique was raw, relying heavily on his upper body brute strength rather than perfect torque, but the results were undeniable. He trained with a manic intensity. This wasn't just about sport, it was about escape. Kerry understood, perhaps subconsciously, that an Olympic gold medal was his passport out of the Von Erich curse. If he could become an Olympic hero, he would be untouchable. He could be a coach, a spokesperson, a celebrity on his own terms. He wouldn't have to bleed in smoky arenas for $50 a night. He wouldn't have to be his father's puppet. By 1979, the escape plan was working. Kerry qualified for the United States Olympic team. He was going to the 1980 Summer Games in Moscow. He held the ticket in his hand. The golden cage of the family business had been unlocked. The destruction of Kerry's life began not in a ring, but in the White House. In early 1980, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter announced that the United States would boycott the Moscow Olympics. It was a geopolitical maneuver intended to punish the USSR. For Kerry Von Erich, it was a catastrophe. When the news broke, the devastation was total. Kerry wasn't a politician. He was a 20-year-old kid who had poured every ounce of his soul into a singular goal. The boycott didn't just cancel a competition. It canceled his future. The leverage he needed to break free from his father was gone. Fritz von Erich did not mourn his son's lost dream. He capitalized on it. To Fritz, the boycott was a marketing gift. He immediately spun the narrative. Kerry wasn't a failed Olympian. He was a patriot denied his destiny, a martyr for the American cause. Fritz pulled Kerry out of the University of Houston and brought him back to the ranch. The psychological shift in Kerry was immediate and dark. Without the Olympics, he had no direction, no identity, and no defense against his father's will. He surrendered. He traded the discus for wrestling boots, not out of passion, but out of resignation. The Kerry Atkinson, who wanted to be his own man, died in 1980. The modern-day warrior was born from the ashes of that resentment. Kerry's entry into world-class championship wrestling in 1980 was explosive. With his Olympic body and movie star face, he was an instant sensation. The camera loved him. He didn't need to know how to wrestle. He just needed to stand there and flex. But the business is cruel to those who treat it as a consolation prize. Kerry was thrown into the deep end. Wrestling experienced veterans who stretched and battered him to toughen him up. The physical toll began immediately. The wrestling schedule of the 1980s was grueling. 7 days a week, double shots on weekends, hundreds of miles of driving in between. For a young man used to the precision of track and field, the chaos of wrestling was jarring. To cope with the physical pain and the crushing pressure of being the golden boy, Kerry found a new crutch. In the locker rooms of 1980s Texas, painkillers and amphetamines were as common as athletic tape. Kerry, with his addictive personality and underlying depression, didn't just use drugs. He devoured them. They became the buffer between the life he wanted and the life he was living. He could be the smiling, high-energy hero in the ring as long as he was numb. The Texas tornado persona was fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and chemicals. By 1984, the Von Erichs were rock stars. They were outselling major bands. Their faces were on magazine covers. And the feud with the fabulous Freebirds was the hottest angle in the sport, but the foundation was rotting. David Von Erich, the yellow rose of Texas, was the glue holding the family together. He was the brother who protected Kerry, who covered for his mistakes, and who was groomed to take over the business. On February 10th, 1984, David died alone in a hotel room in Tokyo, Japan. The official cause was ruptured intestines. Rumors of a drug overdose swirled immediately, but were ruthlessly squashed by Fritz. David's death broke the family, but for Fritz, the show had to go on. There was a massive stadium show scheduled, the Parade of Champions, and he needed a new main event. He needed a Von Erich to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, from Ric Flair to honor David. Kevin, the oldest, was too erratic. Mike was too small. The burden fell on Kerry. On May 6, 1984, in front of 45,000 screaming fans at Texas Stadium, Kerry Von Erich defeated Ric Flair to win the world title. It should have been the happiest moment of his life. The crowd wept. Confetti fell. Kerry held the belt high, looking up at the sky, dedicating the win to David. But in the locker room, the reality was hollow. Kerry knew he wasn't the champion because he was the best wrestler. He was the champion because his brother was dead. He was a placeholder. The belt was a prop in a public funeral. History records Kerry's victory as the pinnacle of the Von Erich legacy. It was the moment they finally conquered the world. But inside the locker room and within the smoke-filled offices of the National Wrestling Alliance in St. Louis, the victory was viewed very differently. It was a mercy kill. It was a political concession to a grieving father, not a coronation of a worthy king. The NWA Board of Directors, a cabal of old-school promoters who controlled the industry, had never intended for Kerry to be the champion. They knew what the fans didn't. Kerry was a liability. He was beautiful to look at, but he was green in the ring, and more dangerously, he was already gaining a reputation for being flaky, a polite wrestling term for someone who was unreliable, high, or mentally checked out. They gave him the belt for one reason: to prevent a riot in Texas following David's death, but they had no intention of letting him keep it. For 18 days, Kerry traveled the world as the champion. Those 18 days were a blur of exhaustion and imposter syndrome. A traveling NWA champion was expected to wrestle 60 minutes every night, defending the title against the toughest men in the territory, calling the spots, leading the match, and making the local challenger look good. This required a level of ring generalship that Kerry simply did not possess. He was an athlete, not a general. Ric Flair, the man Kerry defeated, and the man who would eventually take the belt back, later described those matches. Flair had to essentially wrestle himself while Kerry went through the motions. Kerry would blow up after 10 minutes. He would forget the planned finish. He would arrive at the arena late, eyes glassy, smelling of medicinal sweetness. On May 24th, 1984, in Yokosuka, Japan, less than 3 weeks after his triumph, Kerry lost the belt back to Ric Flair. It was one of the shortest title reigns in history. To the fans, it was a controversial loss, a robbery by the cheating villain. To Kerry, it was a relief. He handed the leather strap back to the referee and walked to the back, liberated from the responsibility of being the best in the world. He didn't want the crown. He just wanted the party. With the burden of the world title removed, Kerry settled into his role as the uncrowned king of Dallas. The period between mid-1984 and early 1986 was the peak of the Von Erich hysteria, and Kerry was its center of gravity. He wasn't just a wrestler anymore. He was a pop culture deity in the Southwest. He couldn't walk into a restaurant without being mobbed. Women camped out on the lawn of the ranch. His face was on lunchboxes, t-shirts, and comic books. This level of fame is toxic for a disciplined mind. For an undisciplined one, it is fatal. Kerry was living the life of a rock star without a band. The WCCW locker room became a notorious den of vice. While Fritz Von Erich preached family values on television, his locker room was awash in recreational chaos. Kerry was the ringleader. He was generous to a fault, the good time Charlie, who always picked up the tab and always had the supplies. His drug of choice in this era began to shift. He moved from simple painkillers, necessary for the bumps and bruises, to recreational substances, cocaine to keep the energy up for the late-night drives, and sleeping pills to come down. But there was a darker element to his usage. Kerry wasn't just partying. He was self-medicating a profound anxiety. He was terrified of failure. He was terrified of not being Kerry Von Erich. Every time he walked through the curtain, he had to be the Superman. He had to smile, flex, and pretend that he wasn't mourning his brother or hating the political maneuvering of his father. Fritz saw the behavior. He saw the dilated pupils and the erratic moods, but the sportatorium was sold out. The merchandise was moving. As long as Kerry could make the 8 p.m. bell, Fritz looked the other way. It was a transaction. Kerry gave his body insanity, and Fritz gave him the keys to the kingdom. While Kerry was partying to numb the pain, another tragedy was unfolding that would ramp up the pressure on him even further. Fritz, desperate to replace David, had pushed the third brother, Mike Von Erich, into the ring. Mike was the opposite of Kerry. He was not an athlete. He was a musician, a quiet kid who wanted to work behind the scenes with cameras. He had no interest in being hit. But in the Von Erich logic, if your last name was Adkisson, you wrestled. Mike was forced to step into David's boots. The fans, desperate for the narrative to continue, tried to accept him, but it was clear Mike wasn't built for it. In August 1985, Mike suffered a shoulder injury. During surgery, he contracted toxic shock syndrome. He nearly died. He suffered brain damage and severe weight loss. When Mike returned to the ring, far too soon, forced by Fritz, he was a shell of a human being. He was frail, confused, and prone to violent outbursts due to the brain injury. Kerry watched this happen. He watched his little brother disintegrate in real time. He saw Fritz push Mike out to the ring when Mike could barely tie his boots. This terrified Kerry. It confirmed a suspicion he had held since childhood. They were all expendable. If Mike could be sacrificed to sell tickets, so could he. The only way to survive was to be invincible. You couldn't show weakness. You couldn't say I'm hurt. You couldn't say I'm sad. You just had to be the golden boy. The walls were closing in. The drugs stopped being fun and became a survival mechanism. By 1986, Kerry was taking massive amounts of Vicodin just to feel normal. His reflexes were slowing. His judgment was clouding. He was a ticking time bomb waiting for a spark. Kerry's escape was speed. When the noise of the arena got too loud or the silence of the ranch got too heavy, Kerry got on his motorcycle. It was a 1986 Suzuki Cavalcade, a heavy, powerful touring bike, though he also rode lighter, faster models. Riding was the only time he felt free. Under the helmet, nobody wanted an autograph. On the highway, nobody asked about David, but Kerry rode like he wrestled, with zero regard for his own safety. He was known to weave through traffic at 100 miles per hour, wearing nothing but shorts and sneakers. He rode with a death wish. On June 4th, 1986, the bomb finally went off. It was a hot Wednesday in Texas. Kerry had been at the ranch. There are conflicting reports about his state of mind and sobriety that day, but those who knew him best describe him as agitated, restless. He hopped on his motorcycle. He wasn't wearing a helmet. He was wearing running shorts and deck shoes. He was heading down a road in Denton County. The exact mechanics of the crash are brutal physics. A car pulled out in front of him, or perhaps he took a curve too fast. The details were always fuzzy in the police reports, likely smoothed over by the influence of Fritz in the local community. What is known is the impact. Kerry slammed into the back of a vehicle. He was launched from the bike. He flew through the air, a 240-pound projectile of muscle and bone. He landed hard on the asphalt. The damage was catastrophic. His hip was dislocated, popped out of the socket with violence. But the real devastation was his right foot. The impact had crushed it. The delicate metatarsals were pulverized. The ankle was shattered. The deck shoe offered no protection against the grinding force of the pavement. He lay on the side of the road, the adrenaline masking the worst of the pain, staring at the twisted ruin of his leg. The golden god was broken. Kerry was rushed to the hospital. The trauma team went to work. The initial prognosis was grim but not hopeless. The hip was reduced, the foot was a mess, but the surgeons were optimistic they could save it. They spent hours reconstructing the bones with pins, plates, and screws. It was a masterpiece of orthopedic surgery. Kerry woke up in a hospital bed, groggy from anesthesia and the heavy morphine drip. This is the moment where his life bifurcated. This is the moment where the Von Erich mindset killed him. A normal person, upon being told their foot had been reconstructed, would lie still. They would be terrified of moving. But Kerry wasn't a normal person. He was a man who had been trained to wrestle on broken ribs, to walk off concussions, to deny the existence of pain. Furthermore, He was an addict in a high-stress withdrawal. His body, accustomed to a steady stream of opioids and stimulants, was reacting unpredictably to the hospital setting. He was anxious. He was claustrophobic. He felt the trap closing again. 2 days after the surgery, while the nurses were out of the room, Kerry made the decision that sealed his fate. He needed to get up. Maybe he wanted to use the bathroom. Maybe he wanted to test his strength. Or maybe he was just in a drug-induced haze of invincibility. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. He planted his left foot. Then he planted his right foot, the foot that was essentially a bag of gravel held together by metal wire and stitches. He stood up. He put his full 240-pound weight on the right leg. The sound must have been sickening. The metal pin snapped. The reconstructed bones collapsed under the load. The jagged edges of the bone fragments sheared through the internal soft tissue, slicing arteries and crushing the nerves that had just been repaired. He collapsed in agony, but the damage was done. He had turned a difficult injury into a catastrophic one. The doctors rushed back in, but it was too late. The internal bleeding was massive. The circulation to the foot was destroyed. Within hours, the tissue began to die. Gangrene is a horrifying thing to witness. The foot turned cold, then blue, then black. The smell of necrosis began to fill the sterile room. The doctors delivered the news to Fritz and Kerry. The foot was dead. If they didn't remove it, the infection would travel up his leg and kill him. Kerry Adkisson, the Olympic hopeful, the discus thrower, the man whose entire value was based on his physical perfection, was told he was going to be an amputee. The surgery was performed. They amputated the right foot just below the ankle. It leaves the heel pad to allow for some weight bearing, but the foot, the arch, the toes, the ankle joint was gone. Kerry woke up lighter. He looked down at the sheet. It lay flat where his foot should have been. The psychological break was instantaneous. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He panicked about the image. His first thought wasn't, "How will I walk?" It was, "What will Dad say?" and "What will the fans think?" Fritz Von Erich entered the room. A father should have hugged his son and told him that wrestling was over, that his life was more important, that he would be taken care of. That is not what happened. Fritz looked at the stump. He looked at the ledger of world-class championship wrestling. He looked at the attendance figures. He made a calculation. If the fans knew the Texas Tornado was a cripple, the aura would be shattered. The ticket sales would plummet. Nobody can know, Fritz decided. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Kerry was told to keep his mouth shut. They would concoct a story about a bad break, a long recovery, and a miraculous return. They would hide the amputation from the world. Kerry, drugged, guilty, and desperate for approval, agreed. He signed the contract of his own torture. He agreed to become a phantom. The period following the amputation was a masterclass in gaslighting. WCCW released updates. Kerry is healing nicely. The therapy is brutal, but he's a warrior. Meanwhile, in the seclusion of the ranch, Kerry was living a horror movie. He had to learn to walk again. A prosthetic leg was fitted. A crude plastic shell in 1986 compared to modern carbon fiber blades. He had to learn to trust it. He had to learn to hide his limp. He spent hours in front of mirrors, watching his gait, training his left side to overcompensate so the right side looked natural. But walking was one thing. Wrestling was another. Wrestling requires flexion. It requires you to plant your feet and drive. It requires you to jump and land. A prosthetic foot has no sensation. You cannot feel the canvas. You don't know where your foot is unless you look at it. Kerry had to map the ring in his mind. He had to develop a sixth sense for his balance. He realized that to wrestle, he would have to fuse the leg to his body. He developed the ritual. He would pull on a thick cotton sock over the stump. He would slide on the prosthesis. Then he would take rolls of athletic tape and wrap the top of the prosthetic to his shin until circulation was nearly cut off. Then the boot, a custom-made boot, stiffer than concrete, laced so tight it made his toes numb on the good foot. The pain was immediate. The pressure on the stump was excruciating. But when he stood up in the boots, he looked like Kerry Von Erich. The silhouette was restored. 6 months after the accident, an impossibly short time for such a trauma, Fritz announced Kerry's return. The modern-day warrior was back. The fans cheered, oblivious. They didn't know they were cheering for a man who was swallowing handfuls of painkillers just to walk down the aisle. They didn't see the sweat on his forehead. That was from pain, not exertion. They saw the lie. And Kerry, terrified and broken, gave them exactly what they wanted. He ran to the ring, pumped his fist, and smiled. But the Kerry who smiled was gone. The man in the ring was a construct, powered by opioids and fear, dancing on a plastic foot for the applause of a father who wouldn't let him quit. From late 1986 onward, Kerry Von Erich was no longer wrestling. He was operating a machine. The decision to return to the ring on a prosthetic limb was not just brave, it was medically insane. A wrestling match is a series of violent, unpredictable impacts. The human ankle is a complex shock absorber designed to handle this. Kerry had replaced that biological marvel with a piece of hard plastic and a bolt. To understand the daily torture Kerry endured, one must understand the construction of his secret. Before every match, the ritual was surgical. He would retreat to a private area, a bathroom stall, a locked dressing room, or sometimes just the back seat of his car. He would apply layers of thick wool socks over the sensitive, bulbous stump of his right leg. The skin there was thin, grafted, and prone to blistering. He would then slide into the prosthetic, a rudimentary device by modern standards, stiff and unforgiving. But the prosthetic alone would fly off with the sweat and force of a match. So Kerry became an expert in structural reinforcement. He used rolls of white athletic tape, wrapping them tighter and tighter around the junction where the plastic met his flesh, effectively cutting off circulation to ensure the leg became a rigid extension of his body. Finally, he jammed the entire apparatus into the specially modified wrestling boot. This boot was reinforced with steel shanks and extra leather, acting as a splint. Once laced, his right ankle was fused. It could not bend. It could not rotate. It was a concrete block. In the ring, Kerry had to reinvent his entire center of gravity. He could no longer push off his right foot. He couldn't pivot. If you watch the tapes from this era, you see the subtle, desperate adjustments. He initiated every move from his left side. When he ran the ropes, he hit the turnbuckle with his left hip. When he threw a punch, he didn't drive from the back leg. He used his immense upper body strength to torque his torso, dragging the dead weight of the right leg along with him. He became a pendulum, swinging the prosthetic leg like a club rather than using it as a limb. The margin for error was zero. If an opponent grabbed the wrong leg for a takedown, the prosthetic could detach inside the boot, or worse, the boot could come off entirely. Kerry wrestled in a state of hypervigilance, his eyes constantly darting to his right foot, terror masked by a smile. He directed his opponents with whispers in the clinch. Stay left. Don't touch the boot. Stay left. The crowd saw the iron claw and the discus punch. They didn't see what happened inside the boot. The friction was the enemy. As Kerry sweat, the tape would loosen slightly, allowing micro movements of the stump inside the plastic socket. Imagine rubbing raw, grafted skin against hard plastic for 20 minutes of intense cardio. The result was predictable: abrasion, ulceration, and bleeding. By the time the final bell rang, the inside of Kerry's right boot was often a swamp of blood and sweat. The pain was not a dull ache, it was a sharp, biting agony, as if the bone itself was being ground down. But there was a deeper, more sinister pain, phantom limb sensation. The nerves that had been severed during the amputation were still sending signals to a brain that refused to accept the loss. Kerry would feel cramping in toes that were no longer there. He would feel a burning itch on an arch that had been incinerated. This neurological torture kept him awake at night, a ghost pain that no amount of ice could soothe. This is where the chemical dependency deepened from a habit into a necessity. He wasn't taking Vicodin to get high anymore. He was taking it to silence the screaming nerves in a foot that didn't exist. The tolerance built quickly. 5 pills became 10, 10 became 20. He needed uppers to fight the sedation of the painkillers, and downers to fight the jitters of the uppers. He was chemically managing his own biology to maintain the fiction of the Von Erich perfection. The secret necessitated a life of extreme isolation. The wrestling locker room is a communal space, a brotherhood of nakedness, showers, and shared gear. For Kerry, it became a minefield. He became the eccentric of the territory. He stopped changing with the boys. He would arrive at the arena already in his gear, wearing sweatpants over his trunks. After the matches, while the other wrestlers hit the showers to wash off the grime and blood, Kerry would grab his bag and vanish. Rumors started, of course. Wrestlers are gossipers. Some thought he was arrogant, thinking he was too good for the communal shower. Others whispered that he had a hideous skin disease. Very few guessed the truth because the truth was too impossible to believe. There were close calls. On the road, sharing hotel rooms was standard to save money. Kerry would sleep in his boots, claiming he was ready to go or that they were too tight to take off. He would wait until his roommate was dead asleep before crawling into the bathroom to perform the gruesome maintenance on his stump. He washed the bloody socks in sinks, hiding the evidence like a criminal cleaning up a crime scene. This paranoia ate away at his naturally gregarious personality. Kerry was a hugger, a lover of people, but the secret forced him to build a wall. He couldn't let anyone get too close, literally or metaphorically. If a fan hugged him too low, they might feel the hard plastic. If a woman stayed the night, he had to navigate the intimacy without revealing the leg. He lived in a state of constant low-level dread, waiting for the moment of exposure that would destroy his father's business. While Kerry was fighting his private war, the Von Erich family was dealt another crushing blow that shattered whatever mental stability Kerry had left. Mike Von Erich, the brother who had been forced to replace David, had never recovered from his toxic shock syndrome. He was physically frail and mentally unraveling. The pressure to be a Von Erich had destroyed him. He had been arrested for drunk driving, he was prone to violent rages, and he was deeply depressed. On April 12, 1987, Mike left a suicide note. He drove to a nearby lake, crawled into a sleeping bag, and took a lethal dose of Placidol. He was found days later. He was 23 years old. Mike's death broke something fundamental in Kerry. David's death had been a tragedy. Mike's death was a sin. Kerry knew deep down that the business killed Mike. He knew that Fritz's refusal to let Mike be a normal civilian had driven him to that lake. But more terrifying was the survivor's guilt. Kerry looked at the timeline. Jack Jr. was gone. David was gone. Mike was gone. Kerry was the fourth brother. He began to feel targeted. He told friends that he could hear his brothers talking to him. The line between the living and the dead was blurring in his mind. At Mike's funeral, Kerry was a wreck. He was high, he was grieving, and he was terrified. He looked at Kevin, the oldest brother, and saw the same fear reflected back. The dynasty was shrinking. The dinner table at the ranch was surrounded by empty chairs. Parallel to the family tragedy was the economic collapse of world-class championship wrestling. The wrestling industry was changing. Vince McMahon and the WWF were going national, swallowing up territories and stealing talent. WCCW, once a global powerhouse, was bleeding. The fans in Dallas were exhausted by the tragedies. The Von Erich story, once a fairy tale, had become a snuff film. They didn't want to buy tickets to watch a family die. Attendance plummeted. The Sportatorium, once a vibrating cauldron of noise, began to see empty rows. Paychecks started to bounce. The production values dropped. Fritz Von Erich, grieving and bitter, tried to tighten his grip, but the magic was gone. He leaned even harder on Kerry. Kerry was the only star left. He had to work every show. He had to visit every hospital. He had to be the smile on the sinking ship. Kerry's drug use spilled into the public eye during this decline. In 1987, he was arrested at the Dallas/Fort Worth airport. Customs agents found drugs in his bag. In a normal world, this would be a major scandal and potential jail time. But this was Texas, and he was a Von Erich. Fritz pulled strings. The lawyers worked their magic. Kerry got probation. But the halo was tarnished. The fans saw the mugshot. They saw the glassy eyes during the interviews. The modern-day warrior was starting to slur his words. The promos, once full of fire, became rambling, incoherent sermons about the heavens and strength. He was a man shouting into the void, trying to convince himself as much as the audience. By 1988, the situation was untenable. Fritz Von Erich, broken by the loss of his sons and the decline of his business, sold the territory to Jerry Jarrett, a promoter from Tennessee. The WCCW name was merged into the USWA. For Kerry, this was the final signal. The family business was effectively dead. The ranch was a mausoleum. The Dallas territory was a ghost town. He was 29 years old. He had one foot, a massive drug habit, and a resume that only worked in the wrestling ring. He knew he couldn't stay in Dallas. The memories were too loud. Every corner of the Sportatorium reminded him of David and Mike. Every drive to the arena reminded him of the crash. He needed a new stage. He needed to go to a place where he was just a wrestler, not a tragic prince. He needed to go to the land of giants. In 1990, the call came. Vince McMahon was interested. The World Wrestling Federation wanted the Texas Tornado. Kerry packed his bags. He packed the tape, the extra socks, the painkillers, and the secret. He was leaving Texas to conquer the world one more time. He told himself it was a fresh start. He told himself he could handle the big leagues, but he was bringing the darkness with him. He was stepping onto the biggest stage in the world where the lights were brighter, the cameras were sharper, and the scrutiny was intense. He was a master illusionist taking his trick to Broadway, terrified that the wire was about to snap. Kerry Von Erich stepped off a plane in Stamford, Connecticut, and walked into a different universe. If world-class championship wrestling was a family-run circus, the World Wrestling Federation was a multinational paramilitary operation. Vince McMahon had built an empire on precision, branding, and reliability. He was looking for a star to fill a specific void, and Kerry, with his Grecian physique and established fame, seemed like the perfect acquisition. But the meeting at Titan Towers was a collision of two realities. On one side was the corporate machinery of the WWF, demanding schedules, media appearances, and physicals. On the other was Kerry, a man held together by duct tape, secrets, and a fragile ego. Kerry was repackaged immediately. The modern-day warrior moniker was tweaked. He became the Texas Tornado. It was a subtle but significant shift. In Texas, he was a Von Erich, a son of the soil. In the WWF, he was a comic book character, a force of nature from the wild Southwest. But the most terrifying hurdle wasn't the rebranding. It was the physical. The WWF had doctors. They had insurance policies. How did Kerry pass? The answer lies in the unique don't ask, don't tell culture of professional wrestling in 1990. Kerry was a known commodity. Vince McMahon likely knew something was wrong with the foot. Rumors of the accident were widespread, but the extent of the disability, the fact that he was walking on a prosthetic, was kept in the shadows. Kerry mastered the art of distraction. He wore his boots to the exams. He charmed the staff. He relied on the fact that in this industry, if you could walk to the ring and pop the crowd, the medical details were often glossed over. He signed the contract. He was now a WWF superstar. He had traded the protection of his father for the ruthless scrutiny of the world stage. Kerry's debut was a rocket launch. The WWF needed a replacement for Brutus the Barber Beefcake to challenge Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship at SummerSlam 1990. Kerry got the call. It was a dream scenario. The Intercontinental title was the worker's belt, previously held by legends like Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat. To win it was to be stamped as an elite performer, and his opponent, Mr. Perfect, was arguably the best wrestler in the world at making his opponents look good. On August 27th, 1990, at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, Kerry walked down the aisle. The energy was electric. He looked incredible, tanned, muscular, spinning like a dervish. But inside the ring, a delicate dance of protection was happening. Curt Hennig knew. He was a second-generation wrestler, a professional through and through. He knew he had to carry Kerry. He knew he couldn't attack the right ankle. He knew he had to bump around the tornado to make him look like a killer. The match was short, just over 5 minutes. It had to be. Kerry's stamina, ravaged by drugs and the sheer effort of balancing on the prosthetic, couldn't handle a 20-minute technical masterpiece. Hennig flew around the ring, selling Kerry's punches like shotgun blasts. Then came the finish. Kerry spun, delivered the discus punch, and pinned Mr. Perfect. The crowd erupted. Kerry held the Intercontinental title high. It was the apex of his second life. For a moment, the imposter syndrome vanished. He was a champion in the biggest company on earth. He had proven his father wrong, proven the critics wrong. He had climbed the mountain on one leg. But the summit is a lonely place when you can't feel your feet. The victory at SummerSlam was the high. The following months were the withdrawal. The WWF schedule in the early 90s was a meat grinder. In Texas, Kerry could wrestle in Dallas on Friday, Fort Worth on Monday, and sleep in his own bed at the ranch every night. In the WWF, the loop was relentless. 300 days a year on the road. Albany one night, Des Moines the next, San Diego the day after. For a man with 2 healthy legs, it was exhausting. For an amputee, it was a logistical nightmare. Flying was torture. The change in air pressure caused the stump to swell inside the prosthetic. Sitting in a cramped coach seat for 5 hours, with a rigid plastic socket digging into his groin, and shin was agony. By the time he landed, he often couldn't walk without a severe limp. Hotels were no better. Every night was a covert operation. He had to find ice machines to pack his stump. He had to clean the liner of the prosthetic in bathroom sinks, praying the maid wouldn't walk in. The silence of the hotel rooms amplified the phantom pain. The nerve endings, confused and traumatized, would fire randomly, feeling like hot needles were being driven into toes that were currently in a landfill in Texas. To survive the travel, Kerry's drug cocktail evolved. It wasn't just about pain management anymore. It was about oblivion. He needed halcyon to sleep through the throbbing. He needed cocaine to wake up for the 6 a.m. flights. He became a ghost in the airport terminals, hiding behind dark sunglasses, moving with a strange swinging gait that people mistook for swagger, but was actually biomechanical compensation. The WWF locker room was a shark tank. It was filled with massive personalities. Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, Randy Savage, Roddy Piper, Jake the Snake Roberts. These were men who protected their spots fiercely. Kerry was an outsider. He was a Southern boy, a product of the nepotistic territory system. The veterans watched him closely. They saw the strange habits. They saw the boots in the shower. They saw the handlers the WWF eventually assigned to ensure Kerry actually made it to the arena. Some were cruel. Ribbing is a wrestling tradition, and Kerry was an easy target. He was spacey, forgetful, and often high. They would hide his gear. They would mess with his travel itinerary. But others saw the tragedy. Roddy Piper, a man who had his own demons, recognized the look in Kerry's eyes. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a man who was already dead but hadn't stopped moving. Ted DiBiase later recalled matches where he had to literally whisper instructions to Kerry step by step because Kerry was so glazed over he didn't know where he was. The secret of the foot became an open secret among the boys. They didn't talk about it to the office. There is a code among workers, but they knew. They adjusted their matches. They stopped doing toe holds. They stopped doing ankle locks. They worked around the disability, protecting the business, protecting the lie. As 1991 rolled around, the cracks in the Texas tornado facade became visible to the audience. The matches got worse. Kerry's movement became stiff and clunky. The fluid athleticism of his youth was gone, replaced by a robotic heavy style. He couldn't run the ropes with speed. He couldn't take bumps flat on his back without flinching. He began to rely almost entirely on the discus punch. It was a safe move. It didn't require balance. It was quick. His matches became formulaic. Get beaten up for 3 minutes, spin, punch, go home. The fans, who are smarter than promoters give them credit for, sensed something was off. The cheers began to dampen. The tornado wasn't a force of nature. He was a repetitive novelty act. Vince McMahon, seeing the diminishing returns and the increasing unreliability, made the call. Kerry dropped the Intercontinental title back to Mr. Perfect in November 1990. The title reign had lasted 3 months. It was a mirror of his NWA title reign, a brief blinding flash followed by a rapid descent. Kerry was moved down the card. He was no longer the main event. He was the opening match guy, the name on the poster used to warm up the crowd. For a Von Erich, raised to believe he was royalty, this demotion was a humiliation that cut deeper than any knife. While Kerry was struggling to stay afloat in the WWF, the curse back home delivered its final, cruelest blow. Kerry Von Erich was the youngest brother. He was the smallest, standing only 5 feet 5 inches. He had asthma. He had brittle bones. He was never meant to be a wrestler, but he was a Von Erich, and he idolized his brothers. He wanted to be them. After Mike died, Chris tried to fill the void. He took steroids to grow, but they only made his bones more brittle. He broke his arm doing simple moves. He was in constant physical pain and deep depression over the death of his brothers. Kerry loved Chris. He felt protective of him. When Kerry was home from the WWF tours, he would take Chris out, try to cheer him up, but Kerry was drowning in his own addiction. He couldn't save anyone. On September 12, 1991, Kerry Von Erich put a gun to his head at the ranch. He was 21 years old. The news reached Kerry on the road. It broke him. It wasn't just grief. It was horror. The pattern was undeniable. David, Mike, Chris, 3 brothers dead, 3 suicides. Kerry flew home for the funeral. He stood by the grave, another hole in the red Texas dirt. He looked at Kevin, the only other survivor. They were the last 2 standing. But Kerry didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a ghost who hadn't been exorcised yet. He looked at Chris's coffin, so small, so tragic, and he saw his own future. He told Kevin, "I'm not going to make it to 35. It's coming for me too." Kerry returned to the WWF after the funeral, but the light was gone. Late 1991 and early 1992 were the zombie years. Kerry was physically present, but his soul had checked out. He was wrestling on autopilot. His drug use escalated to frightening levels. He was mixing cocaine, painkillers, muscle relaxers, and alcohol in quantities that would kill a normal man. He was trying to induce a heart attack. He was trying to overdose. He was passively suicidal, hoping the drugs would do the job that he didn't have the courage to do with a gun. Yet, his behavior became erratic. He would miss flights. He would fall asleep in the locker room and be unable to be roused. He would ramble to Vince McMahon about dark forces and his brothers calling him. The WWF is a business. Vince McMahon had been patient, perhaps out of respect for the name or pity for the situation, but his patience had limits. Kerry was becoming a liability. If he died on the road, on WWF watch, it would be a PR nightmare. The writing was on the wall. The Texas tornado was spinning out of control, and the machine was preparing to eject him. In the summer of 1992, the Texas tornado finally spun out. Vince McMahon, who had tolerated Kerry's erratic behavior and drug-fueled unreliability for 2 years, finally reached his breaking point and released him. Kerry handed in his badge and returned to Texas, not as a conquering hero, but as a reject. He attempted to salvage his career in the rotting carcass of the Dallas Sportatorium, now home to the Global Wrestling Federation, but the magic was dead. The crowds were small and cynical, watching with pity as their former idol, bloated and stumbling, wrestled for peanuts in the graveyard of his family's legacy. He was a ghost haunting his own life, financially ruined and stripped of the grueling schedule that had been the only thing holding his shattered psyche together. Without the structure of the road, Kerry's existence devolved into a slow-motion suicide. His drug use transcended addiction and became a chemical necessity for survival. He consumed a lethal daily cocktail of cocaine to wake up, Vicodin and Soma to numb the agony of his stump, and Halcyon to knock himself out. The physical maintenance of his secret began to fail. He neglected the hygiene of his amputation, allowing blisters and infections to fester inside his boot. Yet he refused to use crutches, preferring to limp in excruciating pain rather than show weakness. His mind was fracturing. He began to suffer severe memory loss and openly told friends he was impatient to die, viewing the afterlife not as an end, but as a reunion with his brothers. The final tether to reality snapped when his marriage collapsed. His wife, Kathy, who had endured the crash, the secret, and the years of chaos, could no longer battle the monster of his addiction. She left, taking their daughters, Holly and Lacey. For Kerry, this was the decapitation strike. His daughters were the only pure things in his world, and the silence of the empty house amplified his crushing guilt. He sat in their empty bedrooms, holding their stuffed animals, convinced that his death would be an act of altruism, that he was a toxic burden they needed to be free of to have a future. The trap finally closed in the fall of 1992. No longer protected by his father's waning influence, Kerry was arrested first for forging prescriptions and later for drug possession, violating his probation. The Texas judicial system showed no mercy, and he faced a terrifying reality, a potential 10-year prison sentence. For Kerry, prison meant more than confinement. It meant the inevitable exposure of his secret. In a cell, there would be no boots, no tape, and no hiding. He would be exposed as a cripple, his vanity stripped naked before the world. As the court date loomed in early 1993, the hallucinations began. He heard David and Mike calling him from the other side, telling him they needed a fourth man for the tag match. He knew he would never step foot in a cage. He was preparing to go home. Psychologists often speak of a phenomenon known as pre-suicidal calm, a terrifying paradox where a deeply depressed individual suddenly appears at peace. In the final 72 hours of his life, Kerry Von Erich entered this state, shedding the manic paranoia that had defined his existence for months. The frantic phone calls, the drug-fueled rages, and the erratic terror of the police evaporated, replaced by the deliberate, quiet movements of a man who had stopped fighting the current. He began to tie up the loose ends of a chaotic life, distributing personal items to friends, a jacket here, a pair of boots there, not as acts of generosity, but as the inventory management of a man closing down his estate. He visited his young daughters, Holly and Lacey, one last time, holding them with a frightening ferocity as he memorized the smell of their hair and the sound of their voices, banking these sensations to take with him into the dark. When he walked out the door, he didn't say, "See you later." He told them he loved them with the finality of a closing book. The morning of February 18th, 1993, broke cold and clear over Denton County. Kerry woke up and went through his torture ritual one last time, the sock, the tape, the prosthetic, the boot, ensuring his silhouette remained perfect until the very end. He climbed into his white Jeep, placing a massive .44 Magnum pistol on the seat beside him, a weapon chosen for its absolute certainty. He drove to the Von Erich Ranch, a journey that took him through the geography of his lost childhood, passing the fields where he and his brothers once hunted and dreamed of being kings. Now the landscape was a graveyard of memories, every fence post and trail a monument to a dead brother. He arrived shortly before noon, parking the car and walking into the kitchen to find his father, Fritz. The final interaction between the patriarch and the last golden son was brief and heavy with subtext. Fritz, battered by cancer and the grief of burying 3 sons, looked at Kerry, perhaps sensing the shift in his demeanor. Kerry didn't scream about the pressure or the years of abuse. He simply hugged his father and told him, "I love you, Dad." When Fritz asked what was wrong, Kerry offered a merciful lie, claiming he was going for a walk down by the trails to clear his head. He wanted to spare his father the sight of the act itself, to reclaim a moment of agency in a life that had been scripted by others. The screen door slammed shut behind him, marking the last time Fritz Von Erich would ever see a son alive. Kerry walked past the barns and the empty corrals, heading toward a gnarled, ancient oak tree that stood down a slope from the main house. This tree had been a silent witness to the rise of the dynasty, watching the brothers play tag and wrestle in the grass during the golden years, and now it would witness the fall. The ground was hard, the winter air crisp against his fleece jacket as he stood in the shadow of the branches. The pain in his leg, the throbbing that had been his constant companion since the 1986 crash, was minutes away from ending. The noise of the critics, the lawyers, and the demons that whispered in the dark was about to be cut. In his final seconds, the conditioning of the golden boy held firm even against the darkness of suicide. Kerry unzipped his jacket and placed the cold steel barrel of the .44 Magnum against his chest, aiming directly for his heart. Most men in his position choose the head, but Kerry was a creature of vanity, a performer who could not bear the thought of destroying the face that had been his fortune. He wanted to leave a clean corpse. He wanted his father to be able to look at him in the casket without wincing. At approximately 11:50 a.m., he pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the Magnum rolled across the flat Texas land like a thunderclap, and Kerry collapsed instantly, the heart that had pumped the blood of a champion, stopping before he hit the leaves. Fritz heard the shot. Deep in his bones, he must have known what that specific hollow sound meant, having already lived through the suicides of Mike and Chris. He moved as fast as his aging body allowed, rushing out the back door and down the slope until he saw the body under the tree. The horror of the scene was almost biblical, a father finding his fourth dead son. Yet even amidst the collapse of his world, the instinct of the Iron Claw flickered one last time. He saw the peaceful, unmarked face of his son and the gun on the ground, and the reality set in that there was no ruptured intestine story to spin this time. The dynasty was dead. When the phone rang at Kevin Von Erich's house, the silence on the other end was a severance in the universe. Kevin, the oldest brother, the protector, the rock, knew before the words were spoken that he was now the last survivor. He drove to the ranch, passing the police lines and the ambulance, and when he saw his brother being zipped into a body bag, the stoicism that had carried him through the deaths of Jack Jr., David, Mike, and Chris finally shattered. He fell to the earth, pounding the ground and screaming at a God who had seemingly targeted his family for extinction. The news broke across Dallas and the wrestling world within hours, not with shock, but with a deep, crushing resignation. The industry had watched Kerry disintegrate for years, and now the meat grinder had finally finished its work. The king was dead, and under the oak tree, the silence was absolute. On February 24, 1993, the state of Texas buried its favorite son, but even the funeral of Kerry Von Erich was a final act of kayfabe, as thousands of fans lined the streets cheering for the Texas Tornadoes and wrestling giants sat in the pews with bowed heads. The eulogies carefully stepped around the darkness. They spoke of the hero, not the amputee, the star, not the addict. He was laid to rest in Grove Hill Memorial Park, his casket placed in the red dirt next to Jack Jr., David, Mike, and Chris. The line of headstones was complete. The performance was finally over. Kerry Von Erich was not merely a victim of a curse or a cautionary tale of excess. He was a human sacrifice offered to the altar of public expectation. He was a man who possessed the courage to wrestle on a raw, bleeding stump for years, enduring a level of physical torture that defies comprehension, all to maintain an illusion for a father who demanded perfection and a crowd that demanded a savior. He burned his body and his mind as fuel to keep the Von Erich light shining, even as he rotted from the inside out. In the final analysis, the tragedy is not that Kerry Von Erich died young. It is that Kerry Adkisson was never truly allowed to live. He was a gentle, sensitive soul trapped in the body of a gladiator, forced to play a role that was written for a man he could never be. He spent 33 years running on a treadmill of pain to buy love with applause. The gunshot under the oak tree was not an act of cowardice, but the final desperate exit of an actor who was simply too tired to take another curtain call. The arena is empty now, the noise has faded, and the Golden Spartan has finally found the only peace he ever knew: silence.